Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats for the final session of the day. Thank you.
Sir, there will be a
For the next panel, Response from a Strategically Fragmented Europe, please welcome on stage Barbara Kunz, Senior Researcher and Director of the European Security Programme at Stockholm International Peace Research Institute.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome to this last panel of the day, which is about strategic fragmentation. And what we will try to do in this panel is figure out how Europe can overcome strategic fragmentations. As we've heard all through the day, the challenges are massive, and so are the insecurities and the uncertainties. But to maybe inject a little bit of optimism in this debate that we will be having here, I would like to point out that two of the factors that used to be the main dividing factors in the European security debate now show us that there is more convergence among Europeans than there used to be. The first such dividing line was, of course, threat perception, and we've just heard in the previous panel that there still are very different threat perceptions. But I would argue that maybe the differences now pertain more to intensity than to the very substance of the threat perceptions, because I do think that we have a consensus in Europe that Russia is a threat, at least a very broad consensus as compared to what we had maybe 10 years ago. And the second dividing factor in the European security debate used to be what analyses capitals had about the most likely future trajectory of the transatlantic relationship, and the question whether the United States would remain a reliable partner in the future. Where also now, this is much less of a heated debate than it used to be, although, I mean, again, the intensity maybe in the conclusion drawn are different. So against the backdrop, and perhaps also thanks to Trump and Putin, who helped Europeans overcome some of these differences, which is, of course, a cynical way. But I mean, again, in sort of from the very narrow perspective of European cohesion, I think these developments have helped. What we want to discuss on this panel is, again, how can we overcome the fragmentations that we still have? And in order to do so, we, of course, have a very distinguished panel with great experts with us. And so I would like to welcome you all to the stage, please. Wherever you like. Welcome, and to just briefly introduce everybody who you can see here, I will start here. We have Sten, Rynning, who is the director of the Danish Institute of Advanced Study and a professor of war studies at the University of Southern Denmark. We have Bruno Tertrais, who's the deputy director of the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique in Paris. We have Karl-Heinz Kamp, who's an associate fellow with the German Council on Foreign Relations, or DGAP as it's known in German. And then we have Rob Johnson, who is the director of the Changing Character of War Center at the University of Oxford. So we have an E3 panel with a guest from the Nordics. And I very much look forward to what you all have to say, and we will keep an introductory round here that will be very E3 focused. But before we start with that, maybe Sten, if I can turn to you and put on both a Nordic but also a NATO hat. Mm-hmm. How realistic is all this talk about Euro-NATO, as it was called this morning, European pillar of NATO, all of that, especially from the perspective of a smaller NATO member state?
Well, thank you, Barbara, and thank you for the invitation to be here from the Norwegian Atlantic Committee. It's a very great pleasure to be here. Of course, my take on this is that we simply don't know what Europe will become, a Europeanized defense option. But I'm convinced that if it happens, it will happen within NATO. So the current NATO we've had for 75 plus years is going, and something new may come about. We could still call it NATO, but it would be different. If that does not happen, the alternative, the plan B that history has in store for us, is really Europe's return to balance of power politics, and that I think you can all gather will not be preferable. So. I think when we address the question, and I'll get to the small state view, but when we address the question, we have to say, what is the nature of change, and how can the Europeans deal with it? And I think just to start with the basics, we have to be very clear that the US is changing, and this is not just about Trump. It's not going away at the midterm elections. It's not going away when there's a new presidential elections. The terms of engagement have changed. And I think we see it in the way most clearly. It could have happened in Greenland. We'll probably talk Greenland tomorrow, I think. But look at the way the US has approached Ukraine. There was a very strong allied consensus on how to approach Ukraine, but Trump has said there's no irreversible path for Ukraine to NATO membership. That was a NATO consensus point. No weapons for Ukraine, no sanctions on Russia, no isolation of Putin. All of this is breaking NATO consensus on an issue that is very clearly of absolute critical essence for Europe. And so we get to this, do you show up, as the former panelists were saying. If that is in doubt, NATO is changing. And if you have, as the Prime Minister was saying, if you have the weaponization of economic policy, that is also a change of alliance policy. So there is change, and we have to look it into the eyes. The second point I'd like to make is that change has already come to Europe as well. If I were to put words to what is happening in the US, it is an era of nationalism. And American nationalism has an ugly side to it. And it's the same thing in Europe. We are living through an era of nationalism, and it's not always pretty. And this debate between the political center and the fringes, where nationalism becomes more unhinged, is very vivid in Europe. The battleground, are typically a culture war or identity politics. It centers on immigration typically, but it's all deteriorating our geopolitical compass. It's diminishing our ability to lead on security and defense issues. And I think it's for this reason, because nationalism is directing the US in new directions, and it's interfering with our political compass in Europe. I think it's for this reason we see the leaders, and we saw it in the panels, both the Prime Minister and the High Representative and the foreign ministers. They are, in essence, saying that institutions are not the answer. Institutions are not the answer. They are like Elvis. They have left the building. They are working by flexible formats in coalitions, signal diplomacy, to recreate an engine of leadership. They are not working the European Council or the North Atlantic Council. They are working their friends, their networks, their flexible formats. Sometimes we call it E3, sometimes we call it Nordic Baltic Cooperation, sometimes we call it the NB8, sometimes we say NB8+, that's Poland, NB8++, then Germany is on board. There are all kinds of formats. The Weimar Triangle. This is the reality. This is where European leadership is. And this is a leadership in Europe that is searching for a new way to anchor Europe's direction because the institutions are too slow. That's what the Prime Minister was saying. And because nationalism is tearing at our buildings and our politics. So where does that leave us? A few observations. One, all this talk about 5% is clearly not the answer. It's a means to an end. It's important. We have to spend money on defense. But money on defense is always a means to an end. And what is the end? Again, institutions are not going to provide the answer. So you don't look to NATO policy, you don't look to EU policy, you got to look elsewhere. And so that gets to your, finally I get to the core of your question. Where's this European pillar going to come from? And I think I would point to three components, and I think it's all going to be vague, but it's all going to grow out of NATO and hopefully be anchored in NATO. But I think component number one, and all these components, they speak to the other panelists, and then they can run with it. But component number one will be a reconfiguration or a reform of the NATO nuclear planning group. That's where you get the high end of deterrence, nuclear weapons. How do you get France and Britain to play a more prominent role in this, and how do you get other allies on board to socialize them into what does nuclear deterrence mean for Europe? You have to have that conversation. It has to be anchored. It has to be a conversation of transition from an all-American to a more Europeanized option. Second, the flanks are important in Europe, the Mediterranean, the high north, the Arctic, but the core of European security still today is the old east-west axis that points into Ukraine. If we can't manage that, then we're in a really bad place. And so, very critically for Europe, we need conventional leadership that can project conventional power into Eastern Europe for reassurance and deterrence. And that is not going to be France and Britain. They're part of the equation, but it's going to be Germany, first and foremost. The center of gravity of conventional reassurance has moved from west to center. So that will have to be a German re-engagement with what it means to be a Western power as in 1955. And finally, and this is where the small countries come in, I think we're back to 1948 when it comes to NATO. Before NATO came into being, it was imagined by Europeans with the Brussels Pact, setting up terms of engagement that the US could relate to and somehow choose to engage. The Brussels Pact countries are the Nordic, Baltic, +++. Poland, Germany, Britain, France. Whatever will happen in NATO and grow out of NATO in terms of a new engine, getting Elvis back into the building, will come out of this group of countries. Those are the countries that are willing to pay and play. And I think we should worry less about what will this look like in terms of organization. That's a typical European preoccupation. We should worry about why they're doing it. Can they give meaning to the idea of a European defense option? Because if it doesn't have meaning, we're not in the end going to be able to mobilize resources for it or sustain public support for it. And this is where the small countries come in, the Danes and the Norwegians and so forth. We have muscle, a little bit, but we also have imagination. And we need to be part of the dialogue with these gentlemen and their countries, giving meaning to why we should have a European defense option. And it cannot be nostalgia. It cannot be, it was so nice in the past. It has to be forward-looking. And it cannot be post-national, as Europe has always been. Let's do it in the EU and it'll be a peace project. Or, another thing Europeans are good at, it's anti-American. Because the Americans are crazy. We're reasonable. Those are dead ends. The imagination will have to be, why do we need European power for the sake of European order? But this is where it is. Back to the Brussels Pact, 1948.
Right. Thank you very much. Well, Sten just mentioned that we need to anchor the direction and that the formats are likely not going to be the existing institutions to provide that direction. So that brings me directly to you, Rob. Does the UK have a vision to provide this direction? And if it does have a vision, does it have the means to live up to this vision?
Well, that's a nice, challenging question. First of all, I want to say thank you, not only for this amazing conference and the wonderful people you get to meet here, but also for the tree which you send from the people of Norway to London, which I go and admire every Christmas. And Sten quite rightly talked about dates, and of course that date commemorates 1940, the national catastrophe for Norway under occupation. And if you don't know, the very first battles for the United Kingdom, other than those out in the oceans as a maritime power, were here in Norway. We lost personnel first in the First War here. And I wanted to say a thank you, a salute, really, to my European and American comrades who I had the privilege of working alongside in Afghanistan as part of the effort we did together. We should not forget that sacrifice wasn't just about values that you can diminish and throw to one side in the sake of interests. They are fundamental to who we are and what matters most. Is the UK really fully committed? I can tell you, yes, it is, 110%. And I can give you evidence of that commitment to this country and to NATO as a whole. There's been consistent evidence in the last few defence reviews or integrated reviews that we've had in the UK. The UK maintains a nuclear-armed navy with over 200 warheads. We're not permitted to release the actual number of warheads anymore to keep Mr. Putin going and in ambiguity. We also have an expeditionary air force, not least 2 group. We have an expeditionary land capability, which in theory can be 2 divisions, plus a rapid reaction brigade. And we have all the enabling functions that go with that, including the newly formed or newly retitled CSOC that we have. So in terms of means, the UK is committed. And I'm delighted that Norway has decided to purchase a Type 26 brand new frigate, new warship, and we're rapidly building Type 31, and I'm hoping you'll be generous enough to buy that one as well. But, you know, how committed are we? The Deputy Commander of the Supreme Allied Command of Europe is a British officer, happens to be a friend of mine, Johnny Stringer, an excellent individual who I know is committed to Europe. And I think, you know, we should go back in our history and understand that the center of gravity for the United Kingdom in many of its conflicts in protecting Europe, the center of gravity was often the Baltic and the Nordic region and the high north and North Atlantic. Our greatest naval victories occurred in the North Atlantic or the Mid-Atlantic. Our greatest naval catastrophes also occurred there too. 1941, loss of HMS Hood, for example. I think what really has been striking about today so far, and in terms of where the UK is and how serious it is, I was classically educated. I was lucky enough to study Thucydides when I was younger in the Peloponnesian War. And some of you here, I know, will remember the great Periclean oratories, that his promises, the populist leader. Let me tell you, he said as a demagogue, how we are going to humble the Spartans. And he mistreated the so-called colonies, the allies. You may remember the Melian dialogue. They rationally tried to reason with this demagogic leader. And you remember, if you go to the very end of the story, Greek civilization is replaced. They fail. Thucydides warns us, if you don't look after your allies, if you don't look after each other, the end will come. You will be eclipsed, and we all know which powers that will be. So the UK is very, very serious. And you need to be serious with the UK. It's the fourth largest technological power in the world. It produces the fourth in the league table, fourth of all the technologies. It has a densely packed island of universities producing great scientific breakthroughs. And I think if you look at the track record of the UK over the last few months and indeed last few years, you will see a country that has committed land forces to Estonia, has assisted in the interdiction of the Bella 1 in the Atlantic, has a carrier strike group with an air wing which is dedicated to the protection of the Nordic and Baltic regions as well as the Atlantic, a continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent. There are British sailors under the waves right now, armed with nuclear weapons, providing that nuclear umbrella. And I don't think we should gainsay that at all. It was the first country to offer security guarantees to Finland and Sweden when they announced that they would join NATO, the first country. And along with France, guaranteed that security thereafter. It is true there are some very, very significant challenges, and the UK does indeed, of course, have defence spending shortfalls at the moment. I am doing my best to persuade the government to change that, I can tell you. I better not go into the disclosures. It's dedicated to supporting Ukraine. This is going to be a 70-year confrontation with Russia, and the UK is determined to see that through to that length of time, as it did during the Cold War. And I don't blame Europeans for not having the wherewithal to deal with a peer-on-peer threat. Let's not forget that for 30 years, we reconfigured the armed forces of Europe and the UK for maritime constabulary, air policing, and counter-terrorism, counterinsurgency around the world. Now we're trying to catch up. And I think the UK was one of the countries that retained heavy armoured divisions, carriers, aircraft carriers, and an expeditionary air wing at a time when everyone was saying, you don't need to have these capabilities because there's going to be no state-on-state war, it's the end of history, and so on. So I think you can rely on the British. They are consistent, and all I would say is, for all of us, is we have to be patient. Grace gives us patience. Be patient with them as we get ourselves geared up, but I have every confidence the UK and its allies will provide the goods, and you can rely on them as allies.
Thank you so much. So clear commitment. Let's move a little bit south now and cross the channel and turn to France. When it comes to France, there's no doubt that France has long-standing ambitions to be a leader in European security. The problem France has had is that it didn't really have followers in at least past years. How do you see things in the current context? What are French leadership ambitions in European defense? And again, same question as with the UK. Does France has the means to live up to its visions?
Right, thank you. 3 quick points to begin with on context. First of all, about the US role and what it expects from Europe. I think there is a fundamental contradiction in the so-called national security strategy. On the one hand, Washington expects, and that's not unreasonable, Europeans to take charge of their own security. At least they would only lead from behind if they ever lead again. But on the other, they deliberately favor political forces, domestic political forces, whose agenda is actually to compromise with Russia or to not consider Russia as a threat. That's a fundamental problem and a contradiction, which I think, a self-contradiction, which I think has not been enough underlined. Second point, my good friend Sten, worse what's coming. I actually fully agree with you that whatever happens next, it's going to be within NATO. I don't see any reasonable path, assuming anyone actually thinks seriously about these issues, where the Europeans would, if the transatlantic contract was to break down, would create something completely new and start from scratch. No, whatever happens, we will use NATO because that's what we have. I was also delighted to hear Ashar VP Kallas this morning blasting the ideas of a European Security Council, which was actually mentioned by one of her own commissioners a few weeks ago. But that was also a French idea, by the way. And just a quick anecdote. When I told to my Élysée friends 5-6 years ago, what does he mean by European Security Council? That doesn't make sense. And I got no answer. And I know that when I get no answers from officials, that means they're not comfortable with the idea. The problem was that, and the problem remains, how do you ensure a good synchronization and consultation, coordination between the UK and the EU if the EU is to take a bigger role? Likewise, but a European Council, so who's going to be the permanent members? Fat chance we're going to be able to agree on who's... That's not going to happen, all right? She also rightly blasted the idea of a European army. I mean, the words have a meaning, okay? If you talk about an army, it's about a single political authority, and that's not going to happen. The third thing I'd like to underline is that because, well, I don't think we've talked about it a lot since this morning, the Mark Rutte fallacy. The Mark Rutte fallacy is that you can't defend Europe if you don't bring exactly the same sort of assets and strategy that NATO has today with a prominent US role. I think that's defeatist. I think you could. What you cannot do is implement NATO's current defense plan if you take out completely the US contribution. I think it's completely defeatist to believe that we cannot, by definition, deter Russia and defend against Russia if we don't spend, quote, 10% of our GDP. I think that it's a debate that he closed much too early. Now, getting to your questions, Barbara. I think France, unsurprisingly, sees itself as one of the leaders of European security. It's not about getting followers. We're not on TikTok. I think occasionally France provides leadership on some issues. Greenland, I think, is one issue that I think it did provide leadership and efficient leadership. But like the UK, it also has a global role, including because of its physical presence on most of the oceans. So there will always be a balancing act in French preoccupations, to some extent like the UK, but to some extent only, between, quote, global responsibilities and European defense. The good news is that since the French army withdrew almost all of its forces from Africa, these forces, the army forces, become more available to the defense of Europe. Barbara, I think you very aptly described the concept of autonomy, whatever the label. It's about reducing dependencies, not only on defense, by the way. It's about fundamentally on reducing dependencies. And you were very on target when you said that it's first and foremost, you begin with the ability to judge, including from an intelligence standpoint, the current situation without relying too much on any other outside power. I don't think that the French have any particular format in mind. I mean, It has to be Weimar plus UK, has to be French UK for nuclear, or for the joint planning cell which exists in the Mont Valérien near Paris regarding the coalition of the willing. It's occasionally, the format question is, in a sense, it's not the most important issue. And I don't think there is any willingness or intention or desire, no plan, no intention, no reason for France to exercise a leadership role without some of its key partners. But herein lies the rub, and Barbara, you knew this was coming because you hinted at it, the means. Now, the president said in July of last year that we would actually reach the targets we thought that we had planned to reach in 2030, we would reach them in 27. That's fine. But unfortunately, and believe me, I take no pleasure in underlying that, there is just no way France is going to be able to spend much more than 2.5% in 2030. Just no way. If we get to 2.3, 2.4, that would be an extraordinary victory given our budgetary woes. We are in a dire financial situation. I don't know what comes in 27, but frankly, and I asked a very senior government figure a year and a half ago, how do you get to 3%, let alone 3.5? What's the credible pathway? I can only tell you that I did not get any credible answer. And the person sitting next to me knew that he or she did not have a credible answer or pathway. So that's the problem indeed. By the way, maybe we want to talk about what happens in 27. We have an election, but we may leave it for later.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you very much for that take on France, which brings me to the other side of the Rhine and, of course, to Germany, which is definitely one of the countries towards which there are the most expectations, but also the biggest question marks as to where it is headed, how serious it really is about providing leadership in European security. So, Karl-Heinz, what's your take?
Well, first, let me also add a grain of optimism to the entire debate. It might be a contradiction in terms of a German optimist, but I think it exists because things are changing significantly in Germany. Let me make a few points to underline this. First, there is no illusion in the German government on the Trump administration. They realized that Trump despises NATO and defines Europe as an opponent. And Chancellor Merkel knows that even his good rapport, allegedly good rapport with the US president, can change every day. So there is no illusion on this. Second, there is no illusion that the transatlantic relations will get well again as they were. So it's not that we just have to survive the next 3 years, but that the trust in the US has been lastingly damaged. And unfortunately, America remains a deeply divided country with more or less 50% of the people being in this MAGA world, let's call it. And this, of course, will affect the transatlantic relationship in the long term. Third point, European defense against Russia without the US or with significantly fewer support of the US was always regarded as a nightmare, particularly after the attack of the Russians. Today, it is definitely not seen as the preferred option. But should it happen under whatever conditions, Europe might be able to cope with it. Why? Simply because because of Russian capabilities to attack and European capacities to defend and deter are both not static. They are highly dynamic, and they are developing in a sense that Russian industrial and economic base is going down, and the European capacities to defense is going up. And we can discuss for hours whether the European going up is quick enough. Point number 4, very interesting, there is no talk in Germany, in Berlin anymore about the European army. Interestingly enough, in the past, always those were talking about the European army who didn't want to pay for defense at the first place, and were hoping to put it under a different, and we still have some countries in the EU who are doing the same. Point number 5, Germany indeed, and that's your question, how much is Germany able and also willing to do? Germany's readiness to bear a significant part of the burden can be seen in the budget. In 2022, the German defense budget was 50 billion euros, more or less. In 2026, it is 108 billion. This is more than double. And you didn't see this in France, not in the UK, nowhere else in Europe. And we can discuss whether the 50 were way too low before. Absolutely true. For Ukraine, also interesting. This year, in 2026, Germany spends 11.5 billion euros for support of the Ukraine, military and non-military. The interesting thing is that the government asked for 8.5 to the parliament, and the parliament added another 3 on this. So much about the parliamentary support and the public support for Ukraine, despite all the problems we have with the AfD and the populists, and so on and so forth. Point number 6, supporting Ukraine doesn't mean anymore, fortunately, not only giving money or weapons, but to integrate Ukraine in European defense structures as far as possible. So German policy changed over the years from delivery and training to common development and common production. 4 months ago, we signed a memorandum with Kiev for industrial cooperation, particularly for long-range systems and ammunitions and drones. Of course, the High North is no longer, that's point number 7, the High North is no longer a side issue for Germany. We also expanded our viewpoint significantly. We have, since 24, our foreign ministry has official guidelines for the Arctic. We never had this before, and they are now under revision after the Greenland crisis. And of course, we have, as you all know, growing ties with the Nordic countries. You mentioned it in one side sense, the leadership question, German leadership. The Germans are always very careful with leadership, because allies like leadership if you lead them in the direction they want to go anyway. If you lead them in another direction, you are particularly in trouble. Big countries know this, US knows this, UK knows this, France knows this. We are always surprised because we just want to be loved by everyone, and this doesn't work. So this is why Merz follows a tradition of previous chancellors, namely always trying to have a group leadership, and he managed to establish excellent relations to Starmer, to Macron, to Tusk, and to Meloni. Last point, point number 9, does this mean everything is fine? Not at all. Friedrich Merz is criticized, often criticized, for being the foreign policy chancellor who neglects the domestic needs for political reform, economic reform. We have all this long list of things to do. We always have coalition governments in government. Terrible. Because it takes a long, long time. They're always slow. They're always difficult. We have strong populist movements, and we haven't found an answer yet on how to deal with these strong populist movements from the right and from the left. On the other hand, and that's my last point, let's not forget this government is in power for 9 months, for heaven's sake. So give them a little bit more time. So please bear with us, and basically everything will be fine. If it's not fine, it's not the end yet.
Okay, thank you very much. It's of course very, very reassuring that everything will be fine. But something that you all more or less explicitly said is that the formats are maybe not what's most important. What I wonder, however, you still need to find a way to install some cohesion in what we're doing now. Also, as the Prime Minister said this morning, if we all just go in all our sort of individual directions and start investing in the military without coordination, that is not really going to add up to sort of a stronger European defense, at least if you look at things from a European level. And so what I would like to hear more about from all of you is indeed the format question, the constellation question, and maybe starting with you, Sten, and sort of a very NATO focus is what exactly needs to happen within NATO very concretely? Does sort of reducing dependencies on the United States, what exactly does that mean? Does it mean getting closer, if not fully getting there, of being able to implement the plans that have been mentioned, the 3 regional defense plans, without the United States? Is it getting ready to replace US officers and command structures? Like, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, I have, for the past year or so, I have very closely followed the security policy offices of the Norwegian and Danish foreign ministries and their NATO delegations, the NATO ambassadors, in another project of mine that relates to how security expertise interacts with NATO policy decision making. And let me draw a bit on that as I answer you, because I think the nature of the beast in NATO is that it's a tremendous machine for cyclical planning. And the core of NATO remains the NATO defense planning process. That is NATO, and then you latch things onto that. And some of them are very important, like the ministerial guidance for the NATO defense planning process. Others are less important. That could be some Mediterranean dialogue, it could be something Arctic vision, and we'll see what happens. But the core of NATO is the cyclical process related to NATO defense planning. And some policy products are more important because they latch into it. And I think China is increasingly becoming one of those. There's an annual report on China that comes out. This was, of course, initiated in 2019, so it's a pretty young process. But what that does, this annual process, is that it produces capability targets for the NATO defense planning process. And that has to do with technology or cyber or something that is specifically related to China. And it feeds into the machine. This is not the type of machine that will react on a day-to-day basis to whatever happens in the White House or in the news cycle. It turns on and on and on. And that is why we have the Prime Minister saying institutions are too slow. And in a way, that's a good thing, because there's a solidity to this mechanism. And if you listen to the military officers that are queried on, where is the alliance? And they're saying, well, as far as I'm concerned, in my day-to-day business, it's working fine, because the mil-mil relations are good. So what was the question again? I'm being lost in my. What needs to happen in NATO, right?
If we were really serious about reducing our dependencies, what would that mean?
So I'm sorry, I got lost in my own story. But what needs to happen is that this frantic Elvis leaves the building, right? The coalition format, flexible engagement on behalf of the political leadership really should leave NATO and leave the machine to get on with it, because right now we have the summits that upset NATO every year. It's a built-in mechanism to wreck the train year in, year out. Next stop, Ankara. And in a way, NATO would be better off if the chiefs could just go about being difficult in their own domain. And NATO could be run by defense and foreign ministers like during the Cold War. I wrote this in my book, by the way, and I got a lot of heat for diplomats, but I think now the winds are changing. And when they figured out where the political engine is, what kind of change are we getting at? Either because the Europeans managed to agree this with the US, or because this Brussels-packed coalition in Europe comes together to say, okay, now this is the direction we need to work in, then they can step back into NATO and redirect the machine. If they permanently disconnect, of course, that's bad news. But for now, I would say NATO needs to be left alone a little bit and have the chiefs run out on the playground and be crazy for a while. It's like having, kids that need to spend their energy a bit.
Thank you, Bruno. I see you laughing. Do you have comments?
No, I'm not laughing. I'm smiling. I have two comments which may be suggestions. First of all, my understanding is that quite often these days, the US in NATO often speaks first. Now, in the day-to-day machinery, now they often speak last. And I think if that's what's happening, that's great. Daddy is taking off the small wheels of the bicycle. That's excellent. That's excellent. I mean, it's a learning process, and frankly, I'm not very optimistic about the ability of the NATO machinery to work without the US leadership, because that's how it was built in, and whatever happens next, it will be more difficult. But if we take the habit of not, waiting, by the way, the French do this too. They wait for the US so that they can say yes or no. But we expect that. Mm-hmm. But if that's what's happening, I don't think it's a bad thing. Second thing, I'm maybe slightly less familiar than Sten is about the NDPP, but the slowness and the bureaucratic nature of NATO, and I've worked in Brussels, I think I know a little bit how it works. It's a multinational military bureaucracy. How can, it doesn't get as more bureaucratic than it does. It's not adapted to an era where it takes a post or a tweet to alter the nature of the transatlantic relationship. So I think one of the possible answers is invest in the enablers, the C4ISR in particular. And here comes the conundrum. For 20 years, we heard our American friends, our good American friends, tell us, no, don't duplicate. Duplication is bad. Duplication is bad. But now, I think part of the answer to the question raised is some form of limited duplication. So it's a real conundrum. I mean, there's no easy way out of this. There's really no easy way. And anyone who has, maybe you guys have more final, convincing answers, but I'm afraid that we are really in a very difficult situation. Nothing has prepared us, well, maybe the French are mentally a little more prepared, doesn't mean militarily, but mentally more, but we're not prepared for that. So how do we convince, and I end up with that, and the fundamental question is that, how do we convince Russia that if anything really bad happens to NATO, something which has not happened yet, we will still be willing and able to defend effectively against it? And that's slightly more, that's marginally easier because the answer is political and psychological more than purely military. That doesn't really answer the question, right? Does it?
Not really, but I'll try again.
I did my best.
But Karl-Heinz wanted to say something.
On this format thing, I think one has to get the sequence right between format and capabilities. Particularly in the EU, we were discussing for decades different formats because we were not willing to give the means for the formats. We had the battle groups, we had the headline goals, we had the rapid reaction force. Everything existed only on the paper because this is cheap. You can discuss about formats and it doesn't cost anything. So, of course, if you have the means, then you need the format, and that's why NATO is certainly important. But even if you have the means and if you don't have a format, things can work as well. The Rammstein Group is an example that 50 countries come together with the means and the will to do something and manage to support Ukraine, which means providing funds or providing funds for the capabilities means political will and means the political will to change or to reprioritize your spending. And I have problems, honestly, if someone says, well, we don't have the money for this in the next years. Europe plus Canada, which means NATO without the US, has a GDP of $25 trillion, which is 11 times more than Russia, which is now has 2.3 trillion. For God's sake, it must be possible from $25 trillion to squeeze out a certain amount for defense. This, of course, requires political work. You have to convince the people. In some countries this works. In some countries it doesn't work that much, but then it is the fault, quote unquote, of the government not to execute the political will.
Thank you. I'm still not ready to completely leave the formats discussion behind, because one observation you can currently make in Europe is that we also have a proliferation of formats. I mean, you just mentioned some of them. There are plenty more. There are minilateral formats, the Joint Expeditionary Forces, for example. There's also Nordic cooperation. There's the Nordic-Baltic 8. But there's also, has always been, of course, but now also we see a lot of increased and deepened bilateral cooperation. France and the UK would be one example. But again, there's plenty more. And so what I still wonder is, again, against the backdrop of all this cooperation, which per se I believe it's a good thing, but how do you manage cohesion in this sense, and coherence, and how do you make sure that everything goes in the same direction? And so, Rob, what I would like to ask you is, in the context we are in, and this role that we also see emerging for the European Union, I mean, to me, I have to admit it's not entirely clear what kind of actor the European Union is this, beyond sort of trying to foster industrial cooperation and helping with financing and so on. But from a British perspective, how do you view the fact that the UK is not a member of the European Union, and how also, I mean, the UK being a spider in the sort of the web of a lot of these cooperation formats, how do you keep track of everything? How do you not get lost in all these formats?
This is the comedy question, because Britain's not a member of the EU, so what do I think of the EU? I mean, you're asking for it now. The UK has about 83 different partners around the globe in terms of formal arrangements and agreements. And you're right to say, how on earth do you manage? It must be quite complicated. There are an awful lot of people working very hard in the UK to make it work, I can tell you that. Of course, some do overlap. But what my fellow panelists have been talking about is this idea of the Europeans manage both to consent to things, but also pragmatists. There is a degree. We're not all just talking theory, despite what our critics beyond these shores would sort of say. We have common ground. That's the point. So we all agree that deterrence is much better than fighting another great European civil war. We know that. There are a few gaps in our capabilities which, from a pragmatic point of view, these agreements otherwise are simply, nice formalities, and we greet each other in halls of different foreign ministries or amongst heads of state. But actually, there's some practical business. So we know that we haven't got enough munitions. Munitions production's still not where it should be in the European continent and in Canada. So a practical thing that's actually happening that is causing coherence and cohesion is co-production. Co-manufacturing. Britain is buying mobile artillery, the Archer batteries, from Sweden. Sweden and Britain co-produce those anti-tank weapon systems that were so critical to Ukraine in those opening months of the Russian invasion. I know Professor McLaren has just left, but Professor McLaren and I edited a book on this idea of NATO and Russia's war in Ukraine, and how we were seeing strategic integration much more evidently. Now, we've got shortages in missiles, electronic warfare, mobile land fires, and we need to sort out our defence industrial base. And what I would say is, and this is going to upset a few people who are EU people, but I'm going to say it anyway, when you get upset about American tariffs, can I just remind you that when there was the Brexit divorce between Britain and the European Union has insisted on imposing rules. It might be a good idea to consider the reason why Americans are going for tariffs is because the EU was the one that imposed rules of how you trade with the European continent. Now, you might say that's absolutely vital, but I would rather see the European Union impose fewer rules on its allies and friends, like Norway and the UK and Turkey, and actually start to impose costs on its adversaries. It is frankly immoral that the EU continues to spend more money to the Russian exchequer on oil and gas than it gives in aid to Ukraine. That is wrong. I'm going to say it as it is. I hope not upsetting the heads of state and some prime ministers on here, but it's vital that we understand actually how we are operating, and the coherence we need is to change that equation, like I say, impose fewer rules, and start to not only train together at sea and in the air and land and so on as we do, but really manufacture together. Because it's the manufacturing and the producing nations of the world that generate wealth. We've become rather too enamored by the sort of luxury of the service sector and so on. By the way, AI is going to replace, artificial intelligence will replace your service sector. So don't get comfortable about that. And the Chinese are after the reserve currency, by the way, as well. So we need to wake up, start manufacturing together, co-produce. And let's say, I've already mentioned the agreement, over Type 26, but Euro Typhoon has been a success story. The British have discovered they're not very good at making armored vehicles anymore. Rheinmetall makes some fantastic equipment, and I think it's a case of now finding these niches. British are great at making submarines. We're wonderful at making warships. Sweden's better at making artillery. So are the Germans at making mobile artillery. Let's all start to make sure these productions fit with what we actually require.
Right. Rob mentioned manufacturing together, and that, unfortunately, I should say, brings me to the FCAS, and more broadly to the state of the Franco-German relationship, because traditionally, at least, in good old Western European integration stories, leadership would come from the Franco-German tandem. Now, it looks like that tandem is rather dysfunctional these days, and the possible failure of the FCAS project, so the idea of building the next generation fighter jet and surrounding systems together, at least based on media reports, it looks like might not happen. So, Karl-Heinz, if I might ask you first from sort of a Berlin view on this, how much of a problem is it if Paris and Berlin are not on the same page?
Well, I think it's the illusion of the 1990s that if the Franco-German locomotive moves, then all the others follow. No, they don't, because they don't have to do it anymore. They don't follow anymore because they have different interests. And even between France and Germany, we always had different interests, completely legitimate, and we often papered them over. So there is a lot of honesty now in this relationship, knowing that still working together is something which is absolutely necessary. And that's why we have now, for instance, on the Mercosur, we have different positions because the agricultural sector in France has a different weight than in other countries. FCAS, I think, should not be taken as a pass pro toto for the entire relationship.
Yes.
The question is whether the entire idea of such a project, which is to be ready in 2040, I think, not sure whether I will still see it then, is far beyond what we need today. If you see the capability of Ukraine to be innovative in weeks, then you ask yourself honestly whether you can come up with a project for the next 15, 20 years. And then we can discuss endlessly about the French industry is too strong and so on. It is one element which is likely to fail, but if it fails, then it doesn't fail because of a failure of the Franco-German relationship, but the project itself has maybe overlived its best before date. And we have to think anew. And I'm not sure whether the British-Spanish thing is and has the same fate. However, we have severe. We in Germany, we have some differences to understand France. I mean, if someone suggests that the French worker might not go to pension with 62, but maybe with 64, we have problems to understand this. And then they burn down the entire country. So there are also different cultures in how to deal with it, and this comes up now. Last point, good relations, like it or not, are often depending on personal relations. And if they are working good or not so good, this has consequences for the relations. So yes, we disagree on a number of issues. We can discuss for hours who's right and who's wrong, but by and large, like with the UK, like with Poland, like with the Italians, the overall consensus on the key questions, defense, the threat by Russia, the transatlantic relations, I think is fairly sound.
Thank you. Bruno, do you have any comments?
I don't have much to... I sincerely, honestly agree with 99% of what Karl-Heinz just said. I
Do I have to be concerned?
Look, there's one thing I've learned over the years, is that underestimate the fundamental strengths of the French-German relationship at your own peril. This is a message that I've conveyed to my British and American friends in particular over the past 30 years. And I think that, Barbara, that's, as an expert on the subject, I'm not sure you would disagree. And never underestimate the amount of political capital that the French and German political leaders have been and will be able, I think, to spend to continue to make it work. In particular, I mean, again, I'm not going to repeat what Karl-Heinz said, because I think you nailed it. And about the engine thing, I mean, it's not even something of the 80s, 90s, something of the 80s. No. I mean, the one thing you can say is that we can be a blocking factor in the EU, in the sense that when the Germans and the French fundamentally disagree on an EU thing, it's a blocking factor. So it's a blocking factor more than an enabler. But again, you know, don't reduce the defense and security partnership to FCAS. I mean, again, you know, I'm not going to repeat what Karl-Heinz said. So again, I almost entirely agree with everything you just said.
So would you recommend turning to the Franco-German tandem for leadership on European security?
No, I think these questions of leadership, again, sometimes it can be Franco-German, sometimes Franco-British, sometimes, you know, French, Weimar. I mean, Weimar is a good format, and I find it interesting as a Frenchman to look at the way sometimes of German and Polish friends interact in the Weimar format. Sometimes it's a bit strange. Sometimes it has to be with the UK too. Look, I don't think any single format or tandem can claim to be the leadership, the future leadership of European security. And by the way, you know, if there's an Italian in the room, that person would say, how about us? And it's true. And the French have it. And we never underestimate the Germans, but we do underestimate the Italians. That's for sure. So yeah, I mean, nothing is, you have to have Mrs. Meloni in the room for many of the European affairs we're talking about. So anyway, to some extent, I think these leadership questions, and including these phone call questions, the phone number questions, are only mildly relevant to the real challenges that we face. But the identity of the leaders and the good cooperation, the good chemistry, personal chemistry between leaders is extremely important. You know, the coalition of the willing would not have happened without the good entente between Chancellor Merz, Prime Minister Starmer, and President Macron in particular.
I guess that is reassuring. If I may turn to you again, Sten, and ask you something sort of in your capacity as somebody from the Nordic countries, because what we clearly see is an increased interest of the E3 countries in cooperating with the Nordics. And we also see, that's at least how I perceive it in Stockholm, sort of a discovery in the Nordic countries of these other European countries, especially the ones that are not the UK, and an increased interest in working with them. Would you agree with that assessment? And if so, what do you think would be promising avenues for cooperation? And how would you advise Nordic governments in picking their favorite partners among all the contenders now?
Well, certainly they shouldn't try to make it a beauty contest. They should make the best of everything, which they're also doing. They're working with the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force. They are having the NB8++ with Poland and Germany. France is a little bit of a newcomer politically to the region in terms of defense, because it was always a very pro-Atlantic region. But they all need to be part of that conversation. And I think that the leadership is willing to have the conversation with all of them. What I think is so striking is that it works in concentric circles. I'm not saying one is more important than the other, but there just seems to be these distinctions where the Nordic countries are having their own conversation because they are more alike and more comfortable, and then they add the Baltics, and that's a different conversation. And I don't know whether you picked it up, but the Foreign Minister Espen Barth Eide, he said it, right? He said that well, we should appreciate their experience with the Soviet Union and more, but then we sometimes add a more calm, long-term perspective. And that's exactly what this is, the Nordic Baltic. Those who were more rawly exposed to Soviet history and Russian policy, with this more lean back, more patient Nordic approach. And growing those two together in the Nordic-Baltic area is very important for the region, without having the big kids on the block, Poland, Germany, Britain, France, undo the conversation, because linking the Nordic and the Baltics in itself is very important. Bridging those two experiences, and they are very different. And then see how far that regional dynamic can grow organically with France or Germany or Britain. And I think they're open to business in all directions. And just to comment on the Franco-German engine, it always worked best, of course, when the leaders were in sync. But they always worked best when the structures were favorable to their cooperation. And France and Germany, it's back to the 80s, actually, back to the 70s, right? I mean, this goes way back, when geopolitics favored something that was apart from the US and Britain, and that was about driving the European community. And their economies were much more compatible in a corporate makeup that was distinguished from Anglo-Saxon capitalism. They are challenged today because Europe's economic governance needs to change, and it needs to become much more innovative and dynamic. And that challenges both France and Germany, but in different ways. And they need this to be aligned in order for this engine to be effective. The other challenge is that Europe's center of gravity in terms of vulnerability has moved eastwards. Eastern Europe, like in the interwar years, is again where Europe will be made or unmade. And moving influence from Western Europe into Eastern Europe is just very difficult. You need to have the forces, you need to have the foresight, you need to have the leadership, even if that's a tired word. And that's just proving difficult for the Franco-German engine. And so it's about rebuilding this, and I think the way they connect to the Nordic-Baltic region, to Poland, is part of their, as Karl-Heinz said, we need to have leadership that works through coalitions, that works through groups, so that we're not standing alone on top of the hill and calling out for everyone to follow us. So again, I think it's part of this very dynamic, flexible diplomatic scene that Europe is in. Is a transitory phase, and hopefully it will land where something solidifies.
Yeah. Maybe to also pick up on that, and perhaps Rob, this question is for you, because you just bring sort of an interesting non-continental perspective to the discussion, is we've now talked a lot about the countries that are represented on the panel. We've also, for obvious reasons, talked a lot about sort of the central and eastern parts of Europe. What about the South? How important is it to get the South on board?
Crikey, valuable and vital. I mean, to link together what we just heard from Sten's excellent point. I don't know about you, but when I was younger, I used to play a lot of rugby. And if you're picking your sports team members, Some are faster, but quite slender. Some are big, heavy-set people that you want to put in the pack. Others you want to be wingers and runners, you know they're speedy. So you look at your own team and you look at the strengths they've got. So Turkey today has some of the highest productivity per capita in the European region. That is their strength. They are building new tech industries by enabling small and medium enterprises to embrace the new tech revolution. When in my own country, although you can start a business very easily, it's very hard to get it to scale beyond a certain size. So we need to look at ourselves, look at our talents, and embrace those particular talents. The Greeks see themselves as a maritime nation. By the way, so do the Italians. The Italians have an armored division. They cannot move to Poland because the rail gauges are wrong and because the EU won't let them. It's too complicated, all the paperwork. General Hodges here was one of the first military officers to break through all the EU regulations to be able to demonstrate the power of moving military formations throughout the entire Baltic region. And by the way, also introduced a deception operation to wrong-foot the press by making those US units land in a different port in Germany. Is that right, sir? There we are. Now, that's them. Now, what do you also have to do, though, with any good sports team? You need to look at your adversary and figure out where are their strengths and weaknesses and exploit their gaps and their problems. And I think, when you look at, where the Russians are vulnerable right now, what they're worried about, that's where you apply the pressure. So one of those regions is the Caucasus. Russia has traditionally been very worried about the Caucasus, largely because of the Islamic population and because they took years and years to suppress a very famous resistance leader called Imam Shamil. They also had problems there during the Chechen Wars, the 1990s. But another region, which we mentioned a lot today, is the Kola Peninsula. We've talked about the largest concentration of nuclear weapons at Severomorsk. It seems to me that what we need to do is apply a little bit of our own maskirovka and apply strategic rebalancing by periodically exercising in the high north. Because once Russia knows that we're interested in the region, they will spend billions of rubles hardening those defenses and being concerned about it and employing more and more bases there, like they are doing on the border of Finland. That is money they cannot spend on the war in Ukraine. And if you apply the same pressure from the south on them, and indeed from the East Asian side, you realize that Russia has been unable throughout its history to defend the thousands upon thousands of kilometers of its border. It's always weak on its edges. And indeed, when Russia fails, it's on the peripheries it fails first. And then that ingresses inwards until the shell itself fragments and collapses. So is the Europeans of the South important? Yes. And I don't want to hear any more talk about somehow the Southern Europeans are not as committed as the Northern Europeans. Absolute nonsense. Go to Greece, go to see the Turks, and you'll find they are as committed, and in my view, strategically, they're as valuable as we are.
Does Spain agree?
I don't know.
I allowed myself to ask a question. Do you think Spain agrees with that?
Well, Britain and Spain have a little difficulty over the rock of Gibraltar.
No, it's not about the bilateral relation, but I'm not sure that Spain, which is actually a big Southern European country, would entirely fit in the generalization you just made.
Well, look, Gibraltar, I mentioned Gibraltar on purpose because, to answer your question, it is indeed a strategic location. It guards the mouth of the Mediterranean and the entrance to the Atlantic. And, Britain would love to be able to hold it all on its own without any assistance by anyone. But the reality is that Anglo-Spanish relations, when they're good, means that secure strategic choke point is deeply secure. If Spain and Britain don't get on, that puts that strategic position at risk. And by the way, you also need France for it because you guard, the Western Mediterranean. This is the whole point, of course, of an alliance. One of the greatest remarks ever made about the conclusion of the Second World War was that it was not an American-led effort, it was a genuine Allied effort. And that's the point. That's what we should remember.
Kunz, you had a comment as well.
Yes, on this, on the issue of the South. I think it's easy to mock about Spain because they're not paying enough. The problem is a little bit bigger. We have since ages a East-South divide in NATO, where the East says all the money has to go to us because of Russia, and the South says, no, we have a perspective to the South. The problem of the Southern perspective is that the Eastern perspective, to say Russia is a threat, this can be dealt with linear means. You have a linear threat from Russia, which you can answer with linear means, with defense and forces and so on. The concerns of the South are much more gloomy, which you cannot deal with defense measures. So terrorism in the South, you don't do anything with the means NATO has. So this gap will not go away. The South in general saying, why does all the money go to the East? What about our security interests? But they are not unable, but it's extremely difficult for them to find a task the classical security institutions like NATO could do to deal with the issues. And this is something which is fundamental. Then, of course, you have different governments who do different things, but it is, yes, France could, certainly Spain could do more, but it's not only Spain, it's a general difficulty.
No, that is, of course, a relevant point, and maybe this is not as optimistic as we started on threat perception, but maybe it is also the case that the relative cohesion we've had in Europe about the Russian threat is also thanks to the fact that the South has been, I'm not sure I dare to use the word, but relatively quiet in recent years, which also allowed for that focus on Russia. And the question, of course, is what happens when things flare up in the South again? But this will unfortunately have to be for a different panel because the clock here shows me that we have 8 minutes left. And so I would like to use the remaining time by giving each of you 2 minutes to answer one question. I know, Bruno, that you said that this whole leadership debate is maybe not what we should be having, but what I still wonder is, okay, if we as Europeans need to overcome strategic divides and do something differently than we have in the past because circumstances change, there needs to be a plan, there needs to be a vision of where we go. And so where does that vision come from? Who's going to provide it? Where will it be elaborated? So that would be my final question to each of you, hoping that you have the answers or at least ideas on it. And why don't we just go in this direction, if that's fine with you, Rob?
Oh, crikey. Okay. Look, Britain and France together possess over 500 nuclear missiles. And if we ever had to use them, God forbid, Russia would cease to exist for 200 years. So that's an awesome responsibility, and no one should diminish, that firepower. That is our ultimate deterrence. It's our ultimate insurance. Britain is struggling to pay for it all. So, if Germany might be some generous money coming along, that'd be marvelous. And I made the point, and I won't repeat about sort of defence industries, but I do think we need to sort of now work very hard on scaling up those sort of responsibilities. I would believe, by the way, that that rejoinder about the South is that if Libya had firmed up and become a Russian base, or Syria had remained as a Russian base, I dare say we'd be paying far more attention to the conventional defence of Southern Europe than we do. We have the luxury of strategic depth. Perhaps a final thought is that Henry Kissinger warned that the big Eurasian continent could potentially become a superstate that was detrimental to American interests. So American policy for Kissinger was to keep Russia, China, India, and so on divided. And that Europe is like a sort of a glacis, a seaboard on which American interests depend. So we need to keep reminding the United States that their interests lie here in Europe. We have 3.1 million military personnel without the Americans at all in NATO. We have an armada of navy. We have an air armada to go with it. And when we work together, we are incredibly powerful. It's been said many times, our wealth dwarfs that of Russia. So I think we're in a position not to indulge in the histrionics of sort of, elaborate shouting. Europeans don't really go in for that. We can speak softly. We do carry a big stick. And if we get ourselves prepared, then I think we have nothing to fear.
Right.
I don't want to play down the vision thing, but I have problems with these visions because we had a famous German chancellor, Helmut Schmidt, a social democrat, a nice guy anyway, who was once asked what is his vision, and he said, "Who has visions should see a doctor." And I think this is a famous quote, and I think it goes in the right direction because I happen to believe the Macmillan thing that the question, what drives politics? Events, events, events. And the Greenland case is one example how a single event can create, through a number of different inputs and factors, cohesion which we didn't expect before, even from countries who do not have that much to do with Greenland.
It happened because Trump had a vision.
Well, this is why I would suggest he should see a doctor. So, to come to a serious point back, I honestly think that these events which we have, and there certainly Trump is one of those. I mean, we had tons of wake-up calls in Europe, which we all overslept. Now it is something where Europe is confronted with a real threat from within, and then it works, not as quick as possible, not as good as possible, but step by step. So I honestly think that that Greenland is an example on where it should go and where cohesion could come from.
All right, a strong anti-vision argument here.
Well, I would agree with Karl-Heinz that vision is something we analysts or commentators, we tend to use as a shortcut to what needs to be done. And political leaders, they know that change is about grind. It's about small steps, hard-fought steps every day. And a big vision is to invite trouble when events happen. And I would say, especially at a time when institutions are in flux, when leadership is exercised in flexible coalitions, it's very hard to predict what will happen. Setting out a vision is almost a guarantee that you will look ridiculous in 3 days from now. And so I think, to answer your question, Barbara, I think it's still the right question. How do we move forward? And I think it comes from leaders who are able to not fall for the temptation to be anti-American. This will never be Europe's future. It cannot be. Then get the house in order. Yep. If you have the economy that has a surplus to invest in defense, then you're in charge. If you cannot invest, you're not in charge. This is about the economic foundations of strategic leadership. And then finally, channeling some of that economic surplus into defense capabilities with your friends and partners, that you share with your friends and partners. It's not, I mean, that sounds easy. And that's the vision leaders need to have. And without saying vision, it's very hard to do in the political landscape that Europe is. But I think this is what we should be looking for.
Thank you.
2 points. Since Rob mentioned the nuclear element, I think this is one of the rare elements where the leadership has to be British-French. And I don't think anyone mentioned the very important Northwood Declaration of July 2025. For the first time ever, London and Paris both, one, committed themselves to de facto some form of nuclear protection for Europe, and two, basically opened almost all the doors to further nuclear cooperation on themselves. This was really groundbreaking. And I think whatever comes next will not be up to London and Paris. It will be up to the friends and allies, including Norway, Denmark another. What do you want? What do you need from us? That sort of conversation has been happening over the past 6 to 12 months. These conversations have happened, are happening. Frankly, Carl Hudson and I and others on this panel, and Sten, I know, you have been following these debates for decades now, and I've never seen German leaders and experts talk about the nuclear deterrence question in Europe the way they have. I mean, it's really, most of the taboos, not all of them, thanks God, almost all the taboos are broken. So those conversations are fruitful now, and I think that whatever comes next will not be a British-French construct, but something we do with our friends and allies. Finally, a word of caution about 27, our national elections. I'm going to ask the question you didn't ask, because a lot of people asked me that question. But I'm going to be mildly optimistic. First of all, a surprise is always possible. Out of 3 elections, 2 of them in France over the past 15 years, 2 of them included surprises. We may still have pleasant surprises. And I honestly believe that if the national rally came to power in 27, I think its first priority would be to appear to the rest of Europe and the world as a, quote, normal, quote, responsible political force. They would not be eager to break with what they see, rightly or wrongly, with Gaullist principles or the tradition of foreign policy and defense. And the bad news is that I'm not sure what kind of leaders they would be. So it's a mildly optimistic take. But my main message here, don't assume that if the national rally comes to power in Paris in 27, then everything is, goes down the drain. I think they will do their best to make sure that Paris and France appears as a strong defense partner for their own interest.
Yeah. Well, I'm very happy we got to end this panel on a mildly optimistic note. And with that, thank you, of course, to our panelists. And back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barbara, for leading these 4 guys, truly a European panel, through a very interesting discussion, which leaves us with a lot of food for thought, no quick answers. But I have to say, now Elvis is really leaving the building, and I take you with me, because this was the last panel of a fascinating day. I hope you have learned a lot, got new ideas, if not new visions. That's then you should visit the doctor. But I hope to see many of you back tomorrow, where we are going to discuss the maritime domain, the new geostrategy of the maritime domain. We will start 9:30, and the registration starts 8:30, 1 hour before. So please, like to see you back tomorrow. But thank you very much.
Good stuff. Thanks.